Speaking of operators, just want to give you an example of a few of these operators and how they behave, and you know, some of the things are obvious and some of the things are less obvious. So concise operators are roughly equivalent to binary operators. Concise operators are these those that I call arithmetic assignments in many cases, such as plus, equal, multiply, equal, which roughly mean, like for instance, if you see a formula like this, A plus equals C, it means that it's simply A, like addition happens and then A is modified in place. So this is arithmetic addition. This is arithmetic, arithmetic assignment within arithmetic, right? Arithmetic assignments in general. So multiply and assign, right? So A multiplied and then A gets assigned the result. So those can be written with a shorter form. Plus plus and minus minus are called increment and decrement operators. They come in two forms. We have prefix increment, postfix increment, and decrement. So to give you an example, for instance, let me just save this main function as version 1 and something that we use for demo. Then I'll continue our presentation today with simply redoing it again from scratch and continue with our examples. So for example, if I have an integer counter and the counter equals 0, okay, so I want to count something, then I can say counter equals count plus 1, right? So to increment it. This can be written as a much shorter version, which simply looks like this. Right, so this is an increment by 1, but here of course you can increment by 100, right? It's just simply an addition, so you have some flexibility. But because counters are so popular in software and incrementing or decrementing counters is so widespread that just remember that to increment by 1 you can always use plus plus counter and minus minus examples like that, right? So for instance, minus minus count is another example of decrementing, right? So it is always by 1, right? Increment or decrement by 1. There is another form of this, which I will copy and paste here, right? So you can say increment count, or you can say count plus plus. These are so there are two forms of increment and decrement operators. This is example of a prefix increment operator, and this is an example of a postfix increment operator. They do the same thing. They both increment, except that in a context like this, int copy counter equals count. So if I do it like this, of course I expect what? I expect that I simply take this value and store it here. right? Just take this existing value and initialize another integer with the same value. So let me just temporarily comment everything out so I can start testing here. So I say plus plus, right? And so what happens is that we increment count and then assign or then let's say initialize. And another variable, right? Okay. So basically what we're expecting, the counter originally is 0, then it gets incremented, it becomes 1, and therefore copy counter gets a value of 1 in our case. Let's modify it a little bit and use this form, count plus plus. What happens is that the order of these operations is reversed. So what happens first is we initialize another variable with the original value of the counter. So copy counter gets 0 because counter was initialized with 0 and it stays 0. And then, right, and then we increment the count. So the counter at the end, and the like on the next line, right? We can say that here copy counter is 0, right? And counter is 1. Okay, just you can see that this form is a little bit more complicated because you have to remember that postfix increment and postfix decrement, both plus, plus, and minus, when written after the counter, the action of incrementing or decrementing is taking place after the rest of the of this expression, right, or the rest of the entire statement. This is why I advise you to use this whenever possible, and even almost like forget that this form exists, because it's just much simpler to follow. You say, in this case, so if I comment this out, right, comment this out, look, and if I wanted to bring back the original statement, here copy counter is 1, right, and the counter is also 1. Much simpler. Okay, just be aware of it. I think it's much simpler because when I see a statement like this, right, I begin to doubt. Like I begin to think, what really happens, how it happens, what is this value, and what is this value after I am done. Sometimes you need this, especially when working, accessing arrays of values in memory, and it's convenient to use this postfix decrement sometimes in some algorithms. But generally speaking, this should be your choice number 1. Just an advice, and I'm not going to stay with this topic for very long, but I just say that this version simply has less side effects, and side effects means that something happens, right, like initialization happens, and then also increment happens, which is a side effect. So now you have to compare the outcome of initialization with the outcome of the side effect, and is it all correct, right? So over here, there is no side effect. We must increment before anything else happens because it's a prefix increment version of this plus plus. Just remember that these operators are very convenient, extremely widely used, but I see that people routinely use this without giving much thinking to a side effect nature of this postfix increment or postfix decrement. So use this for my advice.